This is Nan Tynberg of the Palm Springs Public Library's Local History Project. I am here today with Nicole Mutascio Sr., who represents the second generation of 3 generations of Mutascios who have played a vital role in the history of our town. We are at the home of Nick Mutascio, and today's date is January 25th, 1987, Super Bowl Sunday. Nick, I mentioned 3 generations of your family, and it all starts, of course, with your mother and father. And they arrived here in 1922 from, actually from New York.
New York City.
But I want to go back even further than that to Italy.
Yes.
And if you would fill us in on the background of their emigration from Italy to New York to California.
Okay.
That would be fine.
We'll start with mother,
okay.
Josephine Mutascio. Josephine Mutascio came over here with her mother around 1903 because her father was here working on the railroads during the 1890s, and he had sent money for them to come over here. They started off from a little town just outside of Naples. I think it was called Nola.
Mm-hmm.
And they came over here, and they had been away from my grandfather and my mother's side for quite a while. My grandmother did not want to travel over the ocean. That's why they stayed back. And in those days, the men came to America to work, and money was sent back to the families in Italy.
Mm-hmm.
My father went through World War I in the Italian army. He spent 5 years with them in the Alps fighting the Austrians.
And your father grew up in Naples?
Yes, my father grew up in Naples,
Actually,
in a
yes.
little town just outside of Naples, but close to my mother's hometown.
Right.
I think the town was called Cimitero.
Mm-hmm.
It's a little town, very small, like Cathedral City,
Right, right.
about that size.
Right. But they had never met?
They never met,
in
no.
Italy.
They were both...
and his name at the time was Enrico.
Enrico Mutascio.
Mutascio. Mm-hmm.
And right after the war, he decided to come to America because, it's a cute little story about that. In those days, the church would let you have land if you promised a son to the church. Dad did not want to become a priest, so he left Italy to come to America to make his way.
Yes.
It was true. He told me that quite a few times. His mother was very strong, and he was going to go to the priesthood, but he just gathered up what little money he came and came to America. Dad's family never did come. Mother did not come. My dad's father did come over here, just like my other grandfather, and did work on the railroad. They were big men. Dad's father was over 6 foot. I don't know where the shortness came.
But your father was a feisty, as you had described him.
Very strong man.
Yes.
He was manual labor all his life.
Yes, but wiry.
Wiry.
Yeah.
Yes, he was very, very robust. He was a heavy set man, but small.
Yes, yeah. Oh, I thought he was slight and
Oh, no.
wiry and...
My father weighed...
well, we will see the pictures.
Yes, my dad was
Yeah.
is big boned, 5 foot. He was about 5'7", 5'8", but he weighed about 190 pounds. So you can imagine that was most of that was muscle.
Yeah.
He's
Now, your parents met actually in New York.
New York City.
Yes.
Yes, in the Bronx. My mother, I don't know if you want me to tell you about that part of the story, where she was going to marry the gangster. And,
well, you've started, yes. That's
well, she was going to marry a gangster, and he got deported.
Story.
And he wrote letters to my mother for years, 2 or 3 years to be exact, saying that to wait for her, but my grandmother would destroy the letters. And my grandmother wanted my mother to marry someone else, so she made this little deal with my father, and my father and mother got married.
And the rest is history.
The rest is history.
Your history.
Yes.
They came to the desert. There was a large contingent of your family.
Oh yes,
who
there was.
actually came
Mother had a
here.
stepsister who had tuberculosis, and she was married to a gentleman named John Baroni, who had come down. I think they came out here in 1918 for her health.
Yes.
Mother and Dad decided to come out here with them after around 1922. They were disappointed in New York. There was a lot of things that they did not like in the lifestyle and they didn't think it would be a good place to bring up the children.
But
and it was
very adventurous to come out here,
yes,
because of course in New York there was such an enormous Italian community. And
packed up the family
and they came out here, and your family and extended family was the Italian community
yes,
in Palm Springs in 1922.
I don't know, do not know personally of any other families that were here at the time. Dad worked hard. And
he started out as a stonemason here.
What?
As a mason.
A mason. He was a mason, go-for, assistant and everything else like that. So he had no experience in anything except he was a hard worker. Anything he could take on, he would do.
Mr. Baroni, your father's brother-in-law, was
a brick mason.
He was a brick mason,
yes,
and he was working here
excellent
at the time, and
yes,
so he more or less joined up with him for a couple of years. And
his dad was his assistant and did a lot of the manual labor.
He also did many other things.
Oh yes,
described
he was a gardener
yes,
for the Pearl McManus.
Yes, you have some funny stories about
oh yes,
his relationship with the
Pearl had a lot of people working for her at the time, and she had quite a few citrus groves, and Dad's first job with Pearl McManus was pulling the devil grass away from the roots of the citrus tree, and for that he got $25 cents an hour, excuse me. And later on he found out that they were paying the Mexican help 35 cents an hour, and when Dad questioned her, she said, well, they were here first. And Dad was irate about that, so right then and there I think he said that he was never going to work for somebody else the rest of his life, and never did. He always worked for himself.
Yes, we'll segue into the restaurant in a minute. He also did, I think you should mention the fact that he drove the Surrey
he got a little side job as using his own car and his own gas. He got $3 a day to go out to Garnett to pick up the people that arrived in Palm Springs via the train. And a lot of days when it was windy, he would come back with no passengers, no car.
Oh, how did he get back?
We'd walk back across the desert.
My goodness, that was
quite
a long way.
That's about 5 or 6 miles over to the station.
And this would be about 1923,
yes,
24?
About that time.
When did he start Harry's Palm Springs Cafe?
Harry's Palm Springs Cafe, I think, was built, as close as I can remember, in 1927 was the approximate date. The building was, the materials were made first with John Baroni, his brother-in-law. The bricks were made handmade, and then the building was put up from the bricks. Yes. Dad said it was a long, tedious. They did it during the summer, which was awful hot.
My goodness.
And
he also built the house that you were born in.
Yes, he built in the back. There were some, it was sort of like a quadruplex. It had many rooms, family type, and we were all raised back there.
Here was a man who had no formal training certainly in the restaurant business.
That's right.
And he simply started a restaurant on the basis that he wasn't going to work for anybody else.
That's right.
He was just going to do it. And he was very successful.
He was very successful at it.
Were there other restaurants at the time?
There were other restaurants at the time, but Dad's restaurant furnished American and Italian cuisine. You could have top sirloin steak, or you could have spaghetti and raviolis, whatever you want, at a good moderate price.
And the food came in from Los Angeles?
San Bernardino,
San
Los
Bernardino?
Angeles. Most of it San Bernardino was the outlet for the wholesalers.
And where was it exactly?
The
restaurant.
The restaurant.
I know it was on Palm Canyon, but
is on Palm Canyon where the Brandy's is now.
yes.
It's right across from the new Maxim Hotel, right directly across the street in the
hub of town.
Right in the heart of town.
Yes, yes. What was your mother's role at this time? Of course, she was raising, well, we should mention that you were born in 25. You had an older sister and an older brother at the time?
Yes, I had an older sister who was born in 1923, and an older brother born in 1921 back in New York.
And that is Pat?
That is Pat.
Pat, who was born in New York.
New York.
He came out with your family. And your older sister?
Carmela was born in Palm Springs.
And you have a younger sister
And
as
I have
well.
a younger sister, Petronella. She was born in Los Angeles.
And you've all grown, and you were all raised in Palm Springs.
All raised in Palm Springs.
And schooled here.
Schooled.
And so forth. Which
in fact, we were all married, too. All married in Palm Springs.
Definitely find out about that. Your mother was raising this family in the back of the restaurant. We also might mention that there was you were the first pool hall.
Yes, first
in
pool hall bar in the back. Yeah.
And what your mother played a part in the restaurant as well?
My mother was sort of like the brains of the family. She was a heavy woman, didn't do much manual labor. Of course, she did do housework. But she was always came up with the ideas for getting ahead. And my father would make them work.
Yes.
Very good team.
That's terrific. She was a cashier.
She was the cashier and oversaw every little action in there.
Yes.
She sat in the front of the restaurant right by the door. And when the people came to pay their checks, she was there to collect the money. So
she
there
had
was
her
honesty.
finger
On the pulse.
On the operation, right. Although she was an excellent cook and cooked for the family, she did not do the cooking. Do you remember some of the cooks who
Oh yes, we had
these early times?
We had a big Frenchman named Girard, who was Dad's prime cook for most of the period that I remember. An excellent cook who I think came from back New York. And then we had a couple of other cooks. I can't remember their name. One was named Ward. He was an excellent cook and in fact, he taught me how to cook, and my older brother how to cook. Pat became the master cook, and I was a fry cook.
And you and Pat worked in the restaurant.
The family did work.
You did everything from cooking to bussing?
Pot washing glasses, setting up tables, filling the glasses.
Would you say, other than the celebrities whom we'll talk about, would you say that this was a local hangout?
Oh yes.
Locals.
Yes.
These are where the townspeople would come.
People liked my father and my mother, and they knew that they were hardworking people, and they served good food, and they would come to see us and visit. My dad could not walk downtown, but it would take him an hour to cover a block because people would stop and talk to him and want to carry on conversations.
Very much a part of the town.
Very much.
I like your stories about some of the local names that we're very familiar with as young men who would come into the restaurant. Of course, your father always had an open hand, and he fed them.
Oh yes, that was.
And who would they be?
Oh yeah, Frank Bogart and Jim Maynard would come in to the restaurant. Most of the town people, when they did eat out, came to us, I would say. There was Mr. Schumann, Erwin Schumann, who opened a Chi-Chi.
Yes, he would come across the street and eat in your restaurant.
Yes, he was right across the street from the restaurant, and there was a little competitiveness with them. And there's a little story that Dad told me about how he would send a man up there to stand in front of our restaurant and say, "Come down to eat at Chi-Chi's because there's better food down there." And Dad went over and talked to him about it, and that stopped. So there was a lot of small town jealousy going on all over, you know, just...
Sure, sure, you were all fighting for the same
Sure, money. During the Depression, money was
yes. Yes.
And a lot of people nowadays say, you know, you're always so conscious about money. I said, well, I was brought up in that period where money was very important.
Well, your parents worked from the moment they got up until the moment they went to bed, and there was not much social life. My
father, like I mentioned, I think, would get up at 5 in the morning and work all day till 12 o'clock, 1 o'clock that night, and was back up again at 5. And he did this day in and day out. We never closed the restaurant.
Yes. There was no such thing as
There was no days, you know, like a Sunday taking a day off.
Right.
We had it 24 hours a day, 7 days a week.
You mentioned celebrities.
Oh, yes. During the 30s, the movie stars used to come down. One that used to stayed in my mind and was a very dear friend of ours was George Brent, a movie star of the 30s. And he brought down young ladies. The young ladies that I remember was Erin Sheridan, which was a very nice woman, and Betty Davis. And there was a couple more that I can't remember their names. They weren't the greater stars like the ones that I mentioned.
Right, but Shirley Temple did
Shirley
show
Temple,
up, who was a young girl at the time. And
Shirley Temple used to stay at Nellie Kaufman's Desert Inn, and she used to, her mother and father would send out a call for some children to play with Shirley Temple, and we would go over and play her little games with her.
Amuse her.
Amuse her was more like it, yes, Nan.
Speaking of restaurants and celebrities and feeding, the story of the dispersal of the gang, Al Capone's gang.
Oh, yes.
And who ended up in Morongo Valley, and they latched onto this Italian name in Palm Springs. And
well, that was interesting. There was a group of men that had left Chicago when the Capone era ceased, and were hiding in Morongo Valley for their lives. They were threatened that if they came out, that they would be eliminated. And of course, they had to eat, so they contacted my father, Harry, and he used to take food to them. And the first couple of times, he was blindfolded when they took him up there. And they were good people. They meant no harm to anybody. They just had to eat, and Dad would take them the food and cook for them at times, and it was sort of a low key.
As children, were you aware what was happening, or did you hear about it later?
Very little.
Later
very
on?
Little.
Yes.
No, he didn't mention that because.
How much of this did your mother, I'm sure, was.
Oh, my mother knew about it. My grandmother,
was quite concerned.
But not too many other people, because their lives were in jeopardy, and if it got around, they would be hurt. So.
Speaking of your grandmother, she was quite a character.
Oh, yes.
And why don't you describe her and some of her
My
antics?
grandmother was a very small, a very hard Italian. You know, you were always wrong. She was right. She sort of ruled the family even more so than my mother. I mean, she would say
her name?
Her name was Petronella Rizzo, a good Italian name, and she had very little respect for the law when it came to certain things. She didn't hurt anybody, but if like she would bootleg and sell her makings to the sheriff and things like that, and she didn't think that the law pertained to her, and she got into more trouble that way. And the sheriff at one time had to arrest her, even though he was buying her product, and took her to Bannington jail for 3 days, and they let her go. But she was a tough little woman.
And she was around for most of your growing up?
Yes, yeah. In fact, she died in 1945 when I was in the service. But she lived to be about 85. A hard woman, had a hard life, you know.
Yes.
In those days.
But she certainly made do.
She used to sleep, and I don't think I ever told you this before, she slept with a 32 under her pillow. She didn't trust anybody.
That's wonderful. Italian Annie Oakley.
Carried a knife too.
That is wonderful. It's a well-known story that your father had the first air conditioning.
Yes.
And
my father had the first air conditioning.
Farsighted.
Yes.
Although it
I would
took
say
a lot of care.
I say it was one of the first in a commercial building.
I see.
I don't know about homes at that time because there were a lot of wealthy people in Palm Springs at that time.
But they generally would stay from Thanksgiving to Easter, and it probably they had swamp cooling.
Oh, swamp coolers
or
or
other inventions and. Yes, and this would be about 35 to 1935.
Yeah, around that time.
He
yeah,
brought in this mammoth monster.
The people loved it. It was cool in there. It took. My father told me it took it about 6 months to get all the bugs ironed out of it. It didn't run properly for a while, and then of course they straightened it out, and it ran excellent for years until we sold the place.
And where was it? It was not a small unit.
It was about 10 times larger than most units we have now.
Separate room.
Separate room in the back.
And it cooled the pool room as well as the restaurant. And
the whole restaurant.
Yes.
But
not your house.
No. No.
Yes.
No, we slept outside during the summers.
But that's what people say. Yes.
It was beautiful. You'd look at the stars at night.
Your father sold the restaurant, even though it was in
1943, during the height of the war, we sold it because it was difficult to get food. Everything was rationed, and Dad was tired. He was not a young man anymore.
That's true.
And he had worked hard, and he had the Eldorado Hotel, which he also built. And he
built that early 40s?
No, the Eldorado was built 1937, around in that area.
I see. So he was already thinking of other avenues.
Yes, the restaurant became a headache. Help was gone. The men were gone. The cooks were gone.
That's true.
The food, you couldn't get good meats, it became a disappointing operation.
Was the town, probably the town was not as crowded either.
The town was very crowded with soldiers.
But they weren't eating in restaurants.
Well, whatever, yes they could. A chicken fried steak dinner was 35 cents in those days.
Yes.
Even though the men didn't make much, a lot of them would come in. Their wives, the officers. Our hotel, the Eldorado, had officers' dependents living there on a permanent basis. But the town was...
Yes. Do you remember did he sell the restaurant to a local?
The restaurant was sold to Ruby Rubenstein, Ruby's Dunes it was converted to. He was, Ruby was a concert violinist. Had retired, and he went into the restaurant business, and for years it was probably one of the finest eating places in town.
That's right.
It was. We used to go in there.
Lasted for a long time.
He was such a amiable man. He was so good. He stopped talking to you. You didn't have to be the president of the United States. He would, hey Nick, what are you doing? Things like that. And people, my wife and I used to eat there quite often.
Yes, and he had the restaurant for years after
that. Yes, he did. Yes, for years. And then he sold it. I don't think he was feeling too well. Because he was an older man when he bought it.
Yes.
He was not a young man.
He had come in.
I don't know where he came from. Probably back east.
Yes. Your father was. He didn't have time for a lot of social life, but he was involved in everything that was going on in the city. And, for example, he started the Fireman's Fish Fry.
The fish fry.
What exactly was that?
The fish fry was a get-together during the summer of the local people, and it raised money for the firemen. We had a volunteer fireman department, and we needed a little funds here and there, so we would have the fish fry. We'd sell tickets, and you had fish and corn and things like that, and the kids would come, and it was like a Sunday picnic.
Yes, this was the first in 1930, you
1932, I think 31 or 32. We used to hold it at the end of Aleo Road on the O'Donnell Golf Course back in there, right close to the cemetery.
Lovely setting.
It is. It was very nice.
Yes, and was it actually a fish fry?
It was a fish fry. Used to get fish from the hatchery, and then they had other things for people who didn't care for fish. Hot dogs.
Sure.
Whatever.
And this would be very much a local event.
Oh, it was a local event,
yes.
Just like our Desert Circus Parade
exactly.
was a local.
I was going to ask you about that. And your restaurant, the restaurant always did a float.
Oh yes, whenever we had the time.
That, which we will show later. I think that's wonderful. Do you remember as a young man the Desert Circus?
Oh yes, I remember the Desert Circus. I was in a couple of them. In fact, 2 or 3 of the family, all family was in it. The children, I would say.
Right.
And everybody. It was a spontaneous parade at that time.
Sure.
And well, somebody come up to Harry and say, Harry, why don't you go get into the parade this year? And Harry say, well, I don't have time, I'm busy. And he'd think it over, and the next thing you know, we had a big flatbed truck, and we had tables on it, and we were cooking spaghetti and advertising at a restaurant and driving down.
We might mention that your father was called Harry.
Harry, yes.
When he came
not
to the United
Enrico.
States. Yes. Your father was also involved with the incorporation of the town.
Yes, incorporation. Oh, yes. We needed to persuade the local people that we need to be incorporated because we were getting too big, and we needed better fire protection, better police protection, and the amenities were not in, and we needed them at that time. Sewer systems, water systems, and things like that. And you got that with the incorporation.
Do you remember actually the night of the meeting in 38?
No, I don't remember that. I know my father went,
and he worked
with
the committee,
he talked to people.
Powers that be.
Whenever I'll tell you, the best place was when they come into the restaurant.
Absolutely.
And he would talk about it, we need to do this.
Perfect place for politics.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Especially when you got a full stomach, you're very amiable.
He was also instrumental in supporting the rezoning for the first temple.
Oh yes, the temple.
Do you want to talk about that?
Well, the area that they wanted to put the temple in was zoned. I think it was not zoned as a commercial. It was zoned like a R1, maybe possibly an R2 residential, and they certainly.
Would this be Alejo, where the temple is?
Moving back towards the mountain. It was 2 or 3 blocks off the main street, but it's still not zoned for that type of structure. And my father, Stanley Rosine, approached my dad, and who had built the hotel up the Carmelita Hotel at that time, and the Father O'Connor, who was the pastor of the Our Lady of Solitude, and asked him if there was any objections to them putting a temple. And my father said no, and he helped Mr. Rosine get the signatures to get the zoning changed. And in fact, I think my dad, the Father O'Connor's name and my dad were probably the first couple that were on the petition to change it, and they changed it, and they constructed the temple.
Yeah, that's a nice story.
It is.
Very involved, and he wanted everyone else to be treated fairly as well.
Dad had a lot of very good friends in town. Religion didn't enter into it, My father always said to me, he says, you take a man for what he is, not what he represents or what he belongs to. If he's good to you, then you be good to him.
I like his other saying, too, that you stay clean except for your
Oh, yes. My father always...
pockets.
My father's cliche, was that the only thing that was everything was to be clean except your pocket, and that would have to have money in it.
Now, he then more or less retired from the restaurant business per se, but he had built the Eldorado.
The Eldorado Hotel,
in 37, and what you remember about that during the war years would be the soldiers.
The soldiers' dependents.
Sleeping, and also some were housed if they were off duty. They would come in and sleep on the floor.
Oh yes, the soldiers, like Patton's army was stationed down at Desert Center, and whenever they had their weekend passes, they would try to get to Palm Springs, and a lot of them ended up in Palm Springs. And of course, at that time, we didn't have that many rooms available for soldiers, plus the fact that they didn't have the price for them. And my father would we had many lounges around the pool, I mean the hotel there,
sure.
and we would let them sleep on the lounges, and we gave them a blanket and a towel, and that was 50 cents for the evening, and they could come in and take a shower inside. Dad and a lot of the people did, the local people did a lot of things for the soldiers that was never brought to light, you know, like I think I mentioned the fact that Earl Strebe used to let them sleep in the theaters after the movies were over. And a lot of people took them into their homes too. Even then, it was, you know, he had a whole army of men down there.
That's right. No, that has not been mentioned. It must have had a tremendous impact on the town.
It overwhelmed the town logistically, as, you know, food and places to stay, you know. And of course, then we had, a lot of people don't understand that too. The only thing they remember is that Patton was here. We had an air base here. Our local airport was an air transport command when there were quite a few soldiers
Clarence
here.
Macy has talked.
And we also had the hospital, the Attorney General Hospital, the old El Mirador.
Yes.
And there was a lot of military people in town.
Yes.
And they had to have places to stay and places to eat. And the town was sort of thriving during the war. They had a good economy. Money was moving.
Yes, well, Palm Springs seems to have skirted around depressions and...
Oh, yes. Many of my friends, Nan, that I met after were soldiers that went through Palm Springs during the war and came back.
Yes, yes. Many of the physicians who were Attorney General came back and set up practice here. Dentists and yes.
Many of them had heard or had passed through Palm Springs, and they remember the winters. They don't want to remember the summers.
Oddly enough, the war did.
Oh, the war did change Palm Springs.
for Palm Springs. Well, we'd like to talk a little bit about your life. You were born here and raised here, and in addition to working in the restaurant, you did work. You mentioned the Plaza Theater.
Oh, yes.
You and your brother.
My brother and I
worked in the theater and with George and Earl Strebe.
Yes. Well, Earl Strebe ran the theaters. George was managers of both theaters, and Pat and I and Clarence Macy were projectionists. And of course, Clarence went away to the service. My brother never did go to the service. He was overweight. But I was still young enough to work at the theaters. And what did you do? I was a projectionist. You did projection. Yeah, projectioning. Projectioning is a projectionist. Yes. I understand that was rather dangerous too, because you were dealing with very volatile material. The film at that time was still highly inflammable. They had not gone to the safety film. A lot of the prints that were not safety film, you know. Were you aware of it at the time? Oh yes. Oh yes. Yeah. But I was instructed on how to put the fire out or leave or whatever. But Any problems ever? No. The only problems we encountered, my brother and I, were if the film would break. You know, during the war it was hard to get good quality film, and you had a lot of breakage, and it was disappointing that people would get mad at you because the film stopped, and you had to stop and fix it and start it again, and it was interesting. You described, and of course you were younger at this time, but you described as a young man going to the opening, which was I guess in '36, because 1936. Dr. Coker, who was one of the pioneers in Palm Springs, decided he was going to take all of his Coker's babies to the opening of the Plaza Theater, which featured Camille. That night before the opening, we had dinner with Nellie Kaufman at the Desert Inn Hotel, and from there we walked across the street to the Plaza and were entertained with the opening of Camille with Robert Taylor and Greta Garbo. Very interesting. That must have been memorable. I know it was. It was for a young person. Absolutely. And it's one of the highlights. It comes to your mind quicker than most things. Do you remember the radio shows at the Plaza? Yes, the radio shows. Were involved in that? Bob Hope, not Bob Hope, Jack Benny started coming down here to make his shows, the radio shows. And there was a couple that were held in the American Legion. Then most of them moved down to the Plaza Theater, which was much more suitable for that type of entertainment. Bob Hope put on shows. Bing Crosby came down with shows. And in the earlier years, the Amos and Andy show was broadcast from the El Mirador.
Yes, yes, I've heard that.
I think you know about that.
Yes.
But they came down, and it was exciting for a young person to go to one of those shows. You got
tickets were sold, and
tickets were sold and given away.
You were the live audience.
Live audience.
Yes.
Oh yeah, they were done. Everything was live at that time, though.
Sure.
Any flubs went over the air.
That was it. Yes.
It was interesting.
Yes. Well, it seems that the Strebies had their finger on the pulse of what entertainment was all about.
Well, the town was not that large that everybody did not know what was going on. I mean, if something interesting was coming to town, I would say 90% of people knew about it.
Yes.
And either went to it or were part of it.
When you say 90%, did this include the Mexican
yeah.
population, the Indians? What about the Indians? Would they be involved in this?
The Indians were very low profile at that time.
Yes.
It wasn't until the land became valuable that they made their move. I knew quite a few Indians, but they just didn't get involved with what the other people did. In fact, even the Mexicans didn't get that much involved. But I had very dear friends that did go to a lot of the things with us, or were in part of it. They were a lot in the parades, like the Desert Circus parade.
Yes.
And but the most prominent people were the white settlers here.
Yes.
And they did most of the.
We were talking about some of the employment that you had when you were a young man, and you worked at the Plaza Theater and of course in the restaurant. But you also went to school, and you would have gone to school with a lot of local names that are very
Bill Foster, Councilman, the McKitties, a lot of the McKinney clan, which were old time.
Yes.
And the Williams, John Williams, who came here in the early 30s. Helen Louise, she was part of the Coker's Babies.
Yes, she's mentioned often.
Oh yes, yes.
That family. Do you remember, I'm sure you remember Catherine Finchy.
Oh yes, Mrs. Finchy.
And she was head teacher, principal?
She was principal of the grammar school, as we call it.
When you were
yes,
at Francis Stevens?
Francis Stevens School.
Do you remember Mrs. Newberry?
Mrs. Newberry, yes. She was my, I think I was 4th or 5th grade teacher. She was she was, to me, how Hollywood would show a typical school teacher.
I would have envisioned Catherine Finchy that way.
Catherine Finchy was a very strong person who was very, very dedicated to her work. But she did not work with, to me, she did not work with the students as close as Miss Newberry.
Yes.
Miss Newberry was the teacher's teacher.
She has spoken of extremely fondly.
She was
particularly by the Mex-American children who went to school at this time, and she was very warm and
she
loving.
Had teaching down pat. I mean, it was so good. You look forward to going to her class. She was so interesting. She had done so many things. She had been to China, South America. She never married. She was a spinster, a big woman. She was very tall. Of course, being small, being young, and you looked up, you thought she was tall. But I'm quite sure she was tall. I would say she was about 5'9".
Yes.
But
at that time, that was tall.
She did and taught the way you would. It made it very easy to learn, you know. And she made things so interesting that you wanted to learn.
Do you remember some Indian names, Indian children who were in your?
Well, there was
classes?
there was Levi's. Oh, let's see. There's so many. It's been so long.
Well, when we look at the pictures later, you can
it's been so long ago.
Point them out. And
the Sivas, and there's some of the families have been married. The Prietos, the older, but they were only partial. But the full-blooded Indians, Cruz Siva, and the Levis were. They were taken names. They were not tribe names.
Yes.
Potenzio. Were some of the kids.
Did you go on to high school in Banning?
No.
Or what was?
No, I did not go to Banning. I missed that by about a year and a half when they built our school here, and then I went to this school all through the 4 years of Palm Springs High School.
So that would have been junior high. Would that have been Raymond Cree as well?
No, junior high was Nellie Kaufman.
I see.
Nellie Kaufman is the little school on the corner of the junior high here. I was the first class to go to both years to the Nellie Kaufman school.
So you missed that busing. From
I'll tell you, Nan, busing was fine, but you could walk about as fast. We used to walk from uptown to the school. I know a lot of times, or ride your bike.
Yes.
There was a lot of bikers in those days.
Yes, but I meant the stories of being bused from Palm Springs to Banning took a large chunk of one's young life.
That was my brother. My brother got involved in that, I think.
Well, he must have.
Yes,
if you were the first class.
And the kids would start off so early in the morning, and they would come home so late at night. And a lot of times, they wouldn't come home. They'd have to go get the kids because the bus would break down, or the weather got so bad they would stay in Banning. And that happened quite often.
Do you remember teachers from high school days?
Oh, yes.
Memorable people?
Paul Summers.
Oh, sure.
Mr. Henry Greeley. Let's see. It was Coach Glover. Wood Glover was our coach. Mrs. Martin. There's so many more. They just slipped through my mind.
And Moya
Henderson.
She was later, though.
She was later there.
Yes. I'm thinking of landmarks in town that you might have remembered during the early days when you were quite young growing up. And of course, we mentioned the Desert Inn. You mentioned the Easter egg hunts. Were you involved in that?
Yes, the Easter egg hunt by Mrs. Kaufman, Nellie Kaufman, used to have an Easter egg hunt for all the children in Palm Springs every year, and it was fascinating. She did hide eggs all over 20, 30 acres of land, and you'd have to find them. And it was interesting, and the one that collected the most got a nice little prize.
Did you know her particularly well, or?
Yes, we used to. I had a friend whose father worked, Johnny Rating, her father worked for Mrs. Kaufman, and I used to go over and see Johnny because they lived right on the grounds. Most of the help did live on the ground. And we'd go over and see. Johnny said, well, I have to go over and see Mrs. Kaufman, and we'd go over and talk to her, and she'd offer us popcorn and soft drinks or something like that. And she lived very close to this. Well, let's see, it would have been right back at the Village Theater, going to the mountain there. And she'd call us in, and if they'd come on in and have something to drink and something. But she was a very nice person, very hard worker.
Quiet authority.
Oh yeah, strong.
I understand.
You had to be strong in the desert.
Oh, absolutely. These women were true pioneers.
She was good.
And did the Desert Inn have the first swimming pool?
I'm quite sure the Desert Inn, to my recollection, did have the first swimming pool, and I think the El
Was
Mirador.
that a wonderful?
Oh yes, you met a lot
fascination for young
interesting people. Yes. Let's see. Robert Stack was there one day when we were swimming, and they had Janice Page, who was quite
very
beautiful woman.
at the time.
Very fascinating. And you met. I heard that Al Jolson used to swim there. Shirley Temple used to go into the pool and things like that. But the two that I remembered were Robert Stack and Janice Page. We were very young at that time.
Right. Well, when the El Mirador opened, you were quite young, so you wouldn't would not have remembered the opening of that.
No, I don't remember.
You would.
I don't remember too many of the people up there, because it was sort of a secluded place, you know, but you knew who was there.
You mentioned the sunrise services. Were they a part of the Desert Inn?
They were part of the Desert Inn. Mrs. Kaufman would open her gates, and the people would walk through the Desert Inn up to the mountainside, and we would climb up to the cross that was up there. It's long gone now, and we'd watch the sunrise, and they'd hold Protestant services for the town.
That is very, so anybody could just walk in, and
a non-sectarian. It was just anybody who wanted to get up early in the morning, go to a service.
That's lovely. Yes, it must have been beautiful.
It was.
Yeah, it must have been. The Spa Hotel, when you were growing up, was the mud baths? Were the mud baths?
Mud baths were still there. The mud baths were there in a large, old, rickety building, and the mud baths consist of just a little area about, I would say, 4 foot square that you just sat in and went up to your neck in the mud.
Did you ever take a mud bath?
Oh yes, we went in one time. Just as, you know, we took our clothes off and jumped in and jumped back out of it.
Were tourists particularly attracted to that? Is that what they...
Tourists came from all over, you know, Los Angeles, and take the baths, because they were good mineral baths, you know. A lot of Indians used to sit out in front, you know.
Sure. And they, of course, owned it and managed. Is the present spa actually on the grounds?
Right on top of the grounds. The corner of Tahquitz, McCallum, and Indian is where the bathhouse is now. Those arches right in front is where the old bathhouse used to sit.
Yes.
And I can remember a lot of times people parking their cars. The ground was so soft there from the minerals coming through that the cars would sink. They couldn't leave it parked there. I remember one time they had to call the garage. A
very expensive bath. I understand they were 25 cents, but to get your car out.
And it was.
Do you remember Section 14? I'm
Section
sure
14.
You do. Did you have friends who
Oh yes,
lived?
I had a lot of friends that lived on Section 14. Most of the Prietos and the Ortegas and the Hatchets, and it was a very strange part of Palm Springs. It was all Indian reservation, which was limited to exploitation at that time. But all the people who didn't own a home usually had a little place on Section 14, and they were mostly the workers in Palm Springs. And it was a place.
It's quite a mixture, I understand, though, as well.
A lot of black people, Mexicans, Indians, and whites, all mixed, all on that section.
Yeah, so it was right in the middle of town, but yet it was separate too, and of course it...
I heard at one time, and I don't know if I could verify this, that Indian Avenue was one time the main street of Palm Springs, and that the early settlers did not enjoy looking at Section 14, so they moved it over one block and built Palm Canyon Drive. So it changed that, but you know, I can't verify that, but I've heard that as a rumor when I was young.
Yes, Indian Avenue was quite prominent.
Yes,
in the early days. It was.
In fact,
may well have been. Of course, that's where the spa, the baths were.
But Dad says that when he came into town the first time, it was on Indian Avenue.
That's interesting. Yes. I was thinking this morning. Also, we haven't mentioned amenities like grocery shopping. I was thinking in terms of your mother and where she would have marketed.
Well, we had 2 or 3 places in town. We had Hatchett's Market was on Section 14, and even
what was that? A stand, or was it an actual?
It was a store.
A building?
Was just like an old-time grocery store. Not the supermarket type.
Of course not, right.
No, just it had very little refrigeration. The vegetables were just laid out every day. They were not left overnight like they do in the big supermarkets now because of the refrigeration. And the meats were still refrigerated. Then at an early time, I remember in the 30s, they put a Safeway We had a little
I heard about that.
small Safeway. And there was another where right in the center of town, right opposite the old Desert Inn, used to be a little market. I can't remember the name. But there were little markets, little mother.
Yes, and the Lickens store.
Lickens store. Oh yes.
Half of it was.
Oh yes.
A market. Yes.
Mom and Pop operations, as we used to call them.
Absolutely. So. Yeah. Do you remember the Lickens?
Oh yes, I remember Carl. Yes, I remember him. In fact, my father said that the first phone in town was at Carl's place.
Yes,
The place to call. It was a post office.
Between the post office and the phone, he knew what was going on.
He opened up, and then, you know, the irony of it is the first big post office in town was just one store down from them. Mr. Gorham, Pop Gorham, as we used to say, call him. He was the first postmaster that I can remember. Carl Lickens was, but then the first one that was appointed by Mr. Roosevelt.
Wonderful.
He was.
Yes.
He was interesting.
What I was starting to think of was that we have not asked anyone, and I'm thinking of your son Nick Jr. Mutascio Jr.
Yes.
has a very successful operation of beauty salon, also with a Palm Canyon address, and that is the third generation in Palm Springs. But no one has mentioned where people got their hair cut. Was there a barber, a local barber, or a beauty shop, or?
My earliest recollection of a barber shop was I can't even remember his name now. He was an older man, and it was right by the Village Theater, right around the corner of the Village Theater, and everybody went in there. And then there was another place that opened up right a little farther on Palm Canyon up the street. Was called, I think his name was Harry's Barber Shop. But that was about it. Of course, you didn't get too many haircuts in those days.
No.
Your hair was quite long, and so
I assume in the hotels there was something for the women.
Oh yes, beauty salons. In the Desert Inn there was a beauty salon.
Yes.
El Mirador had their own.
But people have not mentioned that.
Oh no, I can remember the beauty salon in the El Mirador, and then also the one in the Desert Inn. There weren't too many beauty salons on Palm Canyon that I remember.
No.
There was a lot of home permanent.
People did that kind of thing, yes, in their own home.
In those days, you know, if you had a home that was close to Palm Canyon, you didn't have to have a business license. You just start doing the work in your home.
Interesting, yeah. The summers. Where did you go in the summer?
The summers were quite warm in those days. A lot of people stayed. In fact, in my early life, we stayed a lot.
Your restaurant was open.
Yes, the restaurant was open. My parents did have a home in Banning that we sometimes went up to cool off, as we used to say. You had to have some time to cool off, or your brains got cooked, and then.
Which was about 10 to 15 degrees cooler, not.
It was like heaven.
Significantly cooler, but that made a difference, yes.
It did make a difference. Just 23 miles away, and it was all the difference to us. There was quite a few families that the Williams and McKinney's had places like up in Morongo and up in Idlewild, which they went to. But we liked Banning. It was easier to get to.
It was close, yes, yes. There were a lot of memorable sort of natural events and semi-disasters. People have mentioned the flood of 28. You were all of 3 years old at the time. Do you remember your parents talking about that, or do you remember it at all?
I don't know do you have the right date? The Great Flood was in 38.
That's what I thought. Yeah, somebody mentioned 28 the other day, and I thought it was 38.
The Great Flood the Great Flood that really hurt Palm Springs was in 1938.
Yes.
And the town was isolated for about 3 days. There was no traffic in or out. We had no electricity and no gas.
Well, you would remember that.
Oh, yes. Yeah. And I can remember my father, we kept the restaurant going with candlelight and bottled gas, as he called it. They used to bring in butane.
My goodness.
And we converted our stoves to butane and fed people, and the business stayed open.
Yes.
But the whole sections of town were underwater.
Yes.
You couldn't get in from San Bernardino.
How did they get relief? How did that, just naturally?
How did we get?
Well, from the water.
Well, the funny thing about that, when it stopped raining,
state of emergency, and
yeah,
the state would come in.
We had a lot of water, but when it stopped, when it quit raining, it wasn't 12 hours. The ground was dry again. You know, the water had run off,
sure.
and the reconstruction started immediately. You know, the bulldozers and the graders, and they came in and made paths too, and they brought in our the staples.
Was there any damage to your store?
There was. I can remember at the time the water coming down from Dry Falls. I don't know if you know where Dry Falls are.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
The water was coming down through Dry Falls, and it was going across the Francis Stevens School. It went through the front of Howard Manor. I don't if you remember the Howard Manor, and filled their pool up with sand. Little minor things got washed away, but the area now located at the Gene Autry Hotel and all the car places along there, that was underwater.
Hence,
the veterans,
bridges have been built, but that was years later.
Yeah, and the flood controls. You know, the water coming out of Palm Canyon, Tahquitz Canyon, and Dry Falls. The water, I can remember, Nan, looking up at the face of San Jacinto here, and every little crack had a riblet of water running through it. It was just that much water.
Yes.
The desert couldn't carry it off.
Yes.
But when it stopped, it didn't take long. Within 3 days, you wouldn't have known the water was in there. It just runs off. But it just isolated Palm Springs. As a young boy, we had a little airport, which is no longer. It was closer to town on Section 14. I think probably someone mentioned it.
Yes, Clarence Mason.
Clarence mentioned, and we used to run out there, and they would fly over the airport. They didn't land, and they would drop off newspapers, and we'd grab them and sell them. And I can remember selling a 3-cent newspaper for $1. I mean, being a capitalist, and we did that.
Took advantage of your
disadvantage of the oh sure, like most people do. Yes. But it didn't take long for the town to come back, but that was the worst water catastrophe we've had. Yes. And then in 1948 we had, I'll give you a real quick thing, we had a little earthquake.
That was the last major.
The last good earthquake in Palm Springs. It was centered at Desert Hot Springs, and it shook us real good.
I understand.
I could see the rocks coming down the mountains. That was very frightening to me.
The young people who were in the movie houses at the time, that was a scare. They ran out.
When I was projectioning,
I believe it was a Saturday.
My wife was working as a telephone operator, and she said the boards almost came over on her, and that was very frightening. And of course, we got very bad PR back east. They said that Palm Springs was leveled. And
they did
all
recently too.
People were calling and wanting to know if their home was destroyed. Then of course, no kidding, people that had permanent homes here that didn't live here. And then the photos started coming out of Palm Springs, and they saw it was a ridiculous thing, and it was overrated.
Was there ever a Richter scale evaluation of that?
I don't think they didn't have. They didn't publicize it. I'm quite sure if we went up to Caltech, we could find out what it was, because they
know if it were as severe as the one in
July. You know now the slightest earthquake, and they give you a figure right away. So it was much stronger than that last one we had earlier this year. Oh yes, it was. It shook up a lot of places real bad. But of course people...
There weren't several-story buildings.
No, but they lost... We had a lot, at that time, we had a lot of adobe homes that were condemned. Non-reinforced adobe homes. And even we still have a couple in Palm Springs. I don't know if you're aware of them, but people still live in them, and they're not up to code. There's some right near where my father lives on Warm Sands that are not code. And they could come in on you.
Yeah, of course, the mobile homes.
Mobile homes get rocked quite a bit, but you know, we have, in all the years that I've lived in Palm Springs, I've never seen any serious damage, and we've had some pretty good shakers. Really have. You know, plates breaking and food coming off the shelves, and that's about the extent of it.
Yes, well, I think our building materials are more flexible than one would think, and can withstand.
Mm-hmm. I heard from somebody that was talking about them that, you know, based on the city is built on sand,
Mm-hmm.
and the sand seems to take the shock
Yes.
much
Muffle
more than
it,
solid
yes.
rock.
Yes.
But they're interesting.
Yeah.
They don't frighten me.
Well, I think people not in California.
It would scare me to
Certainly.
death to look out my window and see a funnel-shaped thing coming at me,
Mm-hmm.
knowing it's going to destroy the town. You know, I think I would die 1,000 deaths, but
Mm-hmm.
you're not aware that you're going to get hit with an earthquake. You know, it's over before you
Yes.
are aware of it.
Yes, you do. You do. In spite of all of the frightening warnings,
Mm-hmm.
we live with it. You mentioned the army worms.
Oh, yeah.
I'm familiar, of course, with crickets and cockroaches. The
Army worms come through. The first time I remember, I was a young boy, and they came through Palm Springs, and they usually start from the southeast and move up through the valley, and they eat everything except the oleanders. And they march. The reason they're called, we call them army worms,
Yes.
I say, is they'll march in a band, say maybe a half a mile wide, and there's nothing on either side of them, and they don't move at random. They move in one direction, and they eat everything. They're about 2 inches long, and they're green with a little hook on one end. They look very atrocious, bad looking. And Palm Springs, as a young boy, my dad told me that they went out to the old airport and were building little dug ditches around to keep them out of Palm Springs and putting oil in them and setting them fire. Of course, that was so long ago. I don't. If they possibly could have been true and might not have, but they were trying to fight them off because they would eat everything. You know,
Yes.
grass
Yes.
and trees.
Yes.
And then it happened. It happened a couple other times. The last time I remember, I was just married to my wife, and we were living out at the Veterans Track,
Mm-hmm.
and they came through, and again they ate everything up. And they passed through. They're very noiseless, and they just destroy it. Bougainvilleas get stripped, and rose bushes. And
We haven't really had any
No.
infestations.
no, it hasn't been for quite a while.
Yes, we have, of course.
If they
other
do, they're only minor,
problems.
and they don't talk about
Yes,
them
it's
anymore. But when they
interesting,
were happening,
yes.
they were written up in most of the papers. They come
Yes.
through.
We've heard also of people who, in the summers, would put the bedposts, the legs of their beds, in water, so
in
the
water
ants
or oil,
don't
and to
get,
keep them out.
yeah,
They crawl.
get
They
to
would.
one.
And they would go right up to your house. They would come to your house instead of trying to go around. They would roll over the roof and down the other side, and whatever was green on the other side would eat it.
Yeah, yeah.
And
Interesting.
the animals would drive the animals crazy. You know, the cats didn't know what they
Sure.
were, and the dogs would jump on them. And
Yeah.
we used to have a lot of crickets too. in
Oh,
Palms.
I'm very familiar with crickets.
Oh.
Yes, I think the last few years we've had an infestation.
Yes,
of
quite a
crickets.
bit, but
Yes.
none like they used to have.
Yes,
Oh.
I've been told that too.
I'm quite sure Joe Anderson has mentioned that to you. Some of the older timers, they used to pile them up 6 foot high, after a night. You know, they used to love
Gosh.
neon signs and things like that, and they would broom them out that
Yes.
next day, and it'd last a
Yes.
couple of weeks. Then they'd go back into hibernation wherever they went.
One good freeze.
That's it.
We'll knock them off, but they're.
We'd have a good rain, and we'd have the crickets. And
Yes.
I'll tell you how they've changed. I remember the last big cricket epidemic we had in Palm Springs. They were brown, dark brown.
Mm.
Now they're light colored.
Mhm.
And they have changed, evolved
Yes.
into a different color.
Yes, they're becoming more
Because I
like
remember I was
the
talking,
desert.
talking to an old timer, and he said, "Yeah, the crickets, those brown things." I said, "They're not brown anymore. They're light colored, like tan."
Right. Yeah, and not just noisy, but dirty.
Oh, they're
Yeah, but we don't have mosquitoes
No.
to speak of, really,
No.
and that's typically
Used to-
desert.
We don't have a lot of things. We do have we have black widows in the summer,
Yes.
but you know, you
Yes,
learn
and
to
of
live
course
with.
the
You learn to live with a
cockroaches.
lot of things. You learn to live when we first came here. You learn to live with the snakes and the
Yes.
coyotes. So
Yes.
you didn't bother them; they didn't
Yeah.
bother you. Every once in a while, want to get in the house, and you have to chase them away.
Yeah. We talked last time, moving on to larger issues, about, and we've touched on this a bit, about discrimination, and you mentioned, I think this is interesting, a philosophical issue, that from your standpoint it seemed that the Hispanics, the Mex-Americans, really got a less of a good deal than other.
Oh, yeah.
Of course, when you were growing up, there were only really 2 black families,
right.
and they were very much a part of the community. Right. It wasn't until the 40s when the blacks moved in. But in terms of the Indians, the blacks, and the Mexicans,
they were
the
discriminated
Mexicans were
against.
discriminated against.
They were not. They were not part of the white settlement in Palm Springs. You saw very few of them on Palm Canyon. You saw very few come into your restaurant. Mm-hmm. Although as kids we played, and we never, we weren't brought into that yet.
Yes.
But I can remember they did not live where you lived.
Mm-hmm.
They lived on Section 14. Mm-hmm. The Crosley family were offered a different section of town because the white people wanted their land, and it was very interesting. And I, of course, was not too much involved in it, but my father did a lot of talking. You know, he used to talk to us quite a bit, and he did not like a lot that went on. You know, and they discriminated against my father too. There were people that were jealous and ambitious and wanted his property, and would say, "How come an Italian family like you can bake so good in Palm Springs when I can't do anything?" So, because Dad worked harder. They didn't want to work like my father did.
Yeah.
And they didn't want to work like the Mexicans did. So they discriminated against them.
Yeah. Also, you talked about environmental issues and your descriptions of really enjoying the canyons and the mountains and what has happened. And
yes, as a young boy, and I'm quite sure a lot of the other early pioneers, their children, we used to live in the mountains, and we enjoyed the canyons and what they had to offer, good fresh water, and you weren't afraid to drink it when you went hiking, and even up on San Jacinto when we used to hike. It was such a beautiful place. And now with the advent of tremendous population, the place has just become, I would say, a cesspool. The canyons, you can't walk in them anymore, and you can't drink the water, and you can't enjoy the scenery. They've driven all the wildlife out.
Yes.
You used to see deer come down Taquas Canyon and Palm Canyon. The coyotes and the roadrunners, and the natural things are all being driven away because we make too much noise. We're messy.
Yeah. And we're overpopulated and
bad. I just think the old days were much better. They were quieter, and you could sit up in Taquas Canyon for a whole day and not hear a soul. Nowadays, tin cans rolling down the stream.
Yes. Well, what do you see for your progeny? Do you see for your grandchildren?
Well, unless they turned it around, it's going to get worse.
Yes. Well,
we were talking about the canyons.
We were talking about, yes, what ecologically the town was like and the surroundings.
I think the people should be a little more considerate of what they have, because they're going to lose it all.
Yes.
And it was such a beautiful place. I guess all of America was so beautiful, just like Palm Springs in the younger days. And if they don't do something, we're going to be in serious trouble. That
does seem to be a thread running through literally everybody who has been here for a long time. The idea of the naturalness and how attractive it was and how pure it was.
We should learn to live with Mother Nature, not fight her all the way. And that's what we've been doing. I'm sorry, but that's the way I feel.
I agree. Nice words to end with. We thank you very much. This was a wonderful interview, and we learned a lot. Actually, we're going to look at some pictures now, and we'll learn even more.
Good.
Thank you, Nick. All right.
All right. Now
Nick, we are on, and we will just talk about some of these wonderful pictures that you have.
Okay. This is the Mutascio family, probably in the late 20s, early 30s. I don't have an actual time of it.
Right. And the gentleman on that is your father.
Father.
And
the woman
the baby.
The baby. Excuse me.
Oh,
the baby. All right. Let me just.
Well, I should go in order.
I can get them here.
Yeah.
Okay. My father, and that is my oldest sister, Carmela. And next to her is my older brother, Pat. Then there is Petronella. That is my grandmother.
Mm-hmm.
Then next to her is, I think she's holding my little sister, Petronella. And Nick, that's me sitting there.
And your mother.
And my mother, that's Josephina.
Great. It's wonderful.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Now the next one here is where I was born, the rock house.
That your father built?
That father built. Okay.
Yes. And the two in front?
The two in front is my older brother and sister. I was too young.
Yes.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Now this here is the first picture of the Harry's Cafe at that time. This is one of the earlier pictures. And that is Harry out in front there. Okay.
Got it. That's great.
All right. And here is, this one is taken a little later, probably about 5 or 6 years, 1932.
Mm-hmm.
Okay?
Yes.
The next photo is the interior of Harry's Cafe with Mr. and Mrs. Harry Mutascio standing and the customers in the restaurant. That is the front portion. The pool hall is in the back with the kitchen in the middle.
Mm-hmm.
Okay?
Mm-hmm.
The next photo here we have are some of the photos of the Desert Circus. This one here was in 1934. The whole Mutascio family riding on the float. It featured spaghetti being cooked as it went down the street.
Fine.
Okay. You tell me when you...
That's fine.
All right. The next photo I have here is one of the floats that the Mutascios, 1936, all the Mutascios, children are on there. Carmela, Pat, I'm in the background behind Carmela, and Petronella.
Yes.
Okay. This is the... You tell me when to stop if you don't have enough film.
No, oh no, this is fine.
This here is the Eldorado Hotel, built in 1937 by Harry and Josephine Mutascio. It's the site now of the First Interstate Bank on Palm Canyon.
That's good.
Okay. I have a photograph of some of the early... This here is a photograph of the graduating class.
Picture.
It's the 8th grade. No, this is the, wait a minute, the 6th grade graduating class at Francis Stevens School. It features some of the old-timers, the Morrisons, the Williams, Mutascios, the Willards.
Okay.
Okay. And I think that's about it. That's about it.
Thank you very much.
Okay.
Thank you.
Oh,